Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The public sector pay cap, a measure that's been at the heart of austerity policies for 7 years, is to be scrapped. The cap currently limits pay increases to just 1%. But this year, prison officers will get a rise of 1.7% and police officers will get an increase of 1% plus a further 1% bonus. Millions of other workers will have to wait till next year to see if they too get a bigger rise. Trade unions have already called the pay rises for police and prison officers derisory. Let's join our Deputy Political Editor John Pienaar, who's at the TUC conference in Brighton. John.
George, it's been years, decades, since we last saw a government locked in confrontation with public sector workers from the classroom to the emergency services. But on the day ministers finally ended their universal public sector workers' pay cap, a struggle on that scale, of that kind, now seems to be becoming alarmingly possible. Would you fancy their job? Today, routine duty at the TUC, but trouble's always round the corner, and now it's come closer. Police get a rise to attract new recruits, so do prison officers, and other workers will too. Above the pay cap, but only just. Today, the government took the latest pay recommendations and shared the news. The pay cap was finally ending, so more pay for public sector workers, where rises were judged necessary.
We need to strike a balance between being fair to public sector workers, making sure that we recruit the best possible people, and also that we hold on to them in the public services.
There's not much gratitude and plenty of anger on show here in Brighton. Teachers, nurses, you name it, want more pay, much more than the rises being dangled today. Strike action, it hurts the kids who need their schooling. Parents aren't always in favour.
Parents are some more in favour. They're in favour of teachers being happy and well paid, and the well-being of teachers. We come first as teachers. When we are well looked after, we look after the children.
You're a mental health nurse. Are you willing to strike?
I'm absolutely willing to strike if it means looking after my own family. At the end of the day, it wouldn't leave patients. You know, the contingency plans would be put in place.
You're a firefighter. Can you see action, strike action coming down the track?
I think if they don't end the pay cap and you know, across the board for all workers, then yeah, I think there is justification for industrial action.
Are you willing to support strikes for higher pay, Jeremy?
Nice to see you all. Thanks very much.
The answer came soon enough. Jeremy Corbyn and Labour were backing the union's struggle for more pay.
The Labour Party totally rejects the Tories' attempt to divide and rule, to play one sector off against another. A Labour government will end the public sector pay cap and give all workers the pay rise they deserve and so desperately need. That is our policy.
Austerity fatigue helped persuade ministers to give ground, but the mood is sour and the giant union Unite is threatening to take action whether or not workers' ballots deliver the kind of turnouts and winning margins for strike action now required by law. Unions haven't sounded this warlike in years. Labour's never been so militant. The party hasn't pledged to support unlawful action, but hasn't plainly refused that support either. This struggle is just beginning, and it could get ugly. John Pienaar, BBC News, Brighton.
The announcement that the pay cap will be lifted comes as new figures show the cost of living rising by more than expected last month. Inflation rose to 2.9% in August. Unions want inflation-busting pay rises, arguing that anything less will mean their workers end up worse off. But where will the extra money come from? Here's our business editor, Simon Jack.
Public sector workers have been on the front line in more ways than one in recent times. The work of the police during terrorist attacks like this one at London Bridge was widely praised, but didn't show up in their pay, which has been in the deep freeze. Today's decision to loosen the cap for police and prison officers marks the end of a pay policy that dates back to 2010.
That is why the government is asking the public sector to accept a 2-year pay freeze. But we will protect the lowest paid.
The freeze turned into a 1% cap in 2012. Not zero, but not enough to keep pace with the private sector or the cost of living.
Over the last 7 years, pay across the board has fluctuated. In fact, in recent months, it's started to edge up. However, those pay rises have been more than eaten up by rises in the cost of living, with inflation retouching a 5-year high just today. But throughout that period, as the government has tried to bring down expense, public sector pay was at first frozen and then capped at just 1% since 2013. The length and severity of that pay squeeze was painful for workers, and now it seems unignorable for politicians.
The government's biggest single cost is public sector pay. Any wider loosening of the cap will get expensive.
The pay cap change today is a relatively small difference for a relatively small group of public sector workers. But if he wants to give significant increases to nurses and teachers and doctors, for example, that's going to cost him billions. And if he wants to spend billions, then he's going to have to decide if he wants to borrow more or whether the rest of us will pay with more tax.
But only bigger pay hikes for more workers will do for union leaders.
People have waited 7 long years. They've had real pay cuts to the tune of thousands of pounds for firefighters, midwives, nurses across public services, and they want to make up the ground that they've lost.
However, lifting the public pay cap won't ease the pressure on the public finances. Simon Jack, BBC News.
Now, it's been 7 years of capped pay for public sector workers. Today, police officers were told they'd get what the government says is a 1% rise and a 1% bonus, with prison officers securing a 1.7% rise. But both deals are well below inflation, and the extra money for police is to come from their existing budgets. Our political correspondent Michael Crick reports now from the Trades Union Congress in Brighton.
News of the Treasury easing the pay cap came through as the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn arrived in Brighton.
Willing to support strikes for higher pay.
Nice to see you all. Thanks very much.
At a trade union congress threatening strikes over pay. He accused ministers of divide and rule and trying to fund pay rises with job cuts.
The public sector pay cap has hit many public sector workers very, very hard. NHS workers have lost 14% over the past 7 years. Any lifting of the cap must be accompanied by the funding to pay for it. We cannot pay for pay rises by further cuts in services or job losses.
We've always been very clear that we need to strike a balance between being fair to public sector workers, making sure that we recruit the best possible people, and also that we hold on to them in the public services. And we've looked at the evidence, we've been working on this over the summer, and we feel now is the time to move to a more flexible approach to make sure we do deal with any issues we've got in the public services so we can continue to have world-class services.
The TUC now represents fewer than 6 million workers, half the figure of nearly 40 years ago, and more they're dominated by public sector unions. And after the latest 2.9% inflation figure, even one of today's beneficiaries, the prison officers, say they're once again going backwards.
It's not 1.7%. For the bulk of our members, the vast majority will get 1.3%. So what we say to government is, this is another pay cut for our members because inflation is running at 2.9%. So my members once again are going to suffer financial hardship as they have been doing since 2010. They've lost on average £4,000.
But they do see the government's austerity pay limits crumbling.
I could see a crack, yeah. I think you could see that straight after the election. Some ministers announced publicly stating that the pay cap would be lifted. Shut down by the Prime Minister, it seems. Now rumours of further announcements in November at the budget, and this announcement today. There's clearly cracks in their policy.
A TUC boss once accused Labour leaders of treating unions like embarrassing elderly relatives. Yet Jeremy Corbyn today gave one of the most pro-union speeches the TUC's heard in modern times. Fight low pay, Corbyn told workers, by signing up.
If you want a job that pays a decent wage, that gives you a chance to get on in life, live independently and enjoy your work, then join a trade union. And for those watching, wherever you are, go online and do it today. You'll never regret it. Thank you, Congress.
But should the fight for higher pay go beyond the law and the new rules on thresholds in strike ballots, as the leader of the biggest union warns ministers?
Don't push us outside the law, because if you push us outside the law, then you are responsible for that. I will never.
No, you are.
No, I will never walk away from my members. So if our members are in dispute and have broken some artificial threshold or haven't reached some artificial threshold, I will support our members. If that means that we are outside the law, then so be it.
So you'd go to jail, would you, for encouraging law breaking?
I don't know about going to jail. The reality is that if a law is wrong, then it has to be resisted. I dare say if you'd have been interviewing Nelson Mandela or Mahatma Gandhi or the suffragettes, you'd have been telling them that they were breaking the law.
But if unions were to break the law in their strikes, would you support them?
We're not anywhere near the issue of breaking laws or not breaking laws. You have to
make your mind up soon, surely.
We will support those people taking action to bring about decent pay levels in our society. We cannot go on expecting public sector workers to take lower than inflation pay rises every year, thus subsidising the services the rest of us absolutely depend on. It's not good enough to congratulate firefighters, police officers and paramedics when they rush into Grenfell Tower, then deny them decent pay the following day.
Delegates here loved what Corbyn had to say, of course. A taste of the reception he'll get at Labour's own gathering here later this month. Yet before June, most union leaders thought Corbyn was leading their members onto the rocks. How times change. Michael Crick, Channel 4 News, Brighton.
Well, the campaign for higher public sector pay has been driven in part by the rising cost of living. Today, the latest figures show that inflation in August matched its highest level for 5 years. Well, our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, is here with me. So, Siobhan, take us through the figures first.
Well, Kathy, the latest figure for August shows inflation rising at 2.9% year on year. That's above expectations. It's been driven by a sharp rise in the price of clothes, which have risen, as you can see, up 4.6% since last year. And that is the highest rate, the highest jump in more than 20 years. Also by a creeping rise in the price of petrol. That's driven in part by those tensions that we've seen in Korea in recent weeks. Now, why is this all happening? Let's take a look at this graph of the value of sterling. You can see here this spike. Well, that was Brexit last year. Yes, it has recovered somewhat, but sterling is still off around 10%. Now, that has led to a rise in exports, but it's also led to an increase in imports, things that we have on our high street. Those prices, therefore, have been nudged up. Food, manufacturing and clothing, like we've seen today. Now, as we've documented so many times on this programme, the problem is those rising prices are not being met with rising wages. The last documented value there was only up 2.1%. And that means, Kathy, that we're all feeling that pain, that difference in our pockets.
So what can the government or the Bank of England do about any of this?
Well, at 2.9%, the inflation rate for August is already well above the 2% that the Bank of England looks to think about raising interest rates. Now, it should be doing that, but with the economy slowing and all those uncertainties around Brexit, they're loath to start raising rates because they're frightened, frankly, of making a bad thing worse.
Siobhan, thank you very much. John.
Well, now, I'm joined by Steve White, Chairman of the Police Federation, and the Conservative MP and Treasury aide, Chris Philp. Steve White, you've broken the cap.
Well, I don't think we have, actually. I think the cap is still firmly on the head of the Chancellor. What we've seen today is a 1% pay rise across the board. But what we've also seen is a government that isn't following its own advice in terms of following the independent pay review body that said we should have had 2% across the board that's consolidated. So I think there's still some distance to go, definitely.
Chris Philp, is this the end of the public sector workers' cap altogether?
Well, the announcement today says that, yes, it is the end of the across-the-board 1% pay cap. The police today got 2%, 1% consolidated and 1% non-consolidated, making 2% in total. And when we set the remits for the public sector review bodies who will set nurses' pay and teachers' pay and so on for the next financial year, the 1% cap has been ended, and that is partly as a consequence of the good and responsible financial management of the economy through what has been an incredibly difficult 7-year period. I think it's good that those labours are now beginning to bear fruit.
Well, in a sense, Steve White, he's telling you that you've been heroic in helping the economy, and you've done your bit for Britain.
Well, I think certainly British police officers up and down the country are heroic every single day. But of course, it's interesting with Chris being an MP. Over the last 2 years, there was an 11% rise, there was a 1.6% rise, and they all said, oh, we have to take this rise because it's an independent body. All we're saying, because of course, unlike your piece in relation to the TUC, we don't have the power of industrial rights as police officers. All we have is the power of persuasion. And all we're asking for is to be dealt with fairly. This is a very small step in the right direction. There's still a huge distance to cover to replace the 15% that we've lost over the past 5 years in real terms pay.
Police lose 15%, but you gain 10% in 2015 and another 1.4% this year, Chris Philp. You're doing nicely for a public sector worker.
Well, I think that's that you need to look at public sector pay in the round compared to private sector equivalents. And if you look at total public sector pay, excluding pensions, but adjusting for the skill mix, because actually public sector workers are on average more skilled than private sector ones. Public sector workers get about 2 or 3% more in cash terms than the private sector. When you add in the effect of public sector pensions, that difference widens to around about 10%. And actually, you know, I've got no problem with paying public sector workers around about 10% more than their private sector equivalents, because they do such an important job for the country. And I'm glad that because of the Conservatives' responsible stewardship of the economy through a very, very difficult 7-year period, that 1% cap has now come to the end. And obviously, the 2% police settlement today is the first step down that road, and I'm pleased we've got there. But it's been hard fought. If we'd done what Labour had suggested and been irresponsible, we wouldn't now be able to do this.
But you're talking against a backdrop of looseness with the economy. If you allowed inflation to go above the 2% that it's generally permitted to go, and worse than that, it therefore means that these police have not only lost 0.9%, you know, nearly 1% in their pay this year, they're 1% poorer, but the whole outlook, given that you're going to take money from their existing budgets, means that the public are going to be less well served. And we know what happens when you cut police numbers. We've seen it on bridges and elsewhere.
Well, I mean, don't forget, you mentioned bridges. I presume you're referring to London, and in fact, in London, police numbers have been constant at around about 32,000 for the last 8 years, so you can't draw a link between police numbers and the attack on Westminster Bridge,
well, it's exactly the link that was drawn. It's exactly the link that was drawn.
Well, it can't be drawn because
police numbers...
Police numbers in London, I'm a London MP, I can tell you, police numbers in London, not across the rest of the country, but in London have been constant at 32,000 officers for the last 8 years. But look, you made the point about inflation a second ago. I mean, during 2014, 15, 16, inflation was pretty much zero, so the pay increases went up in real terms. Now, you're right to say that inflation is currently 2.9. The reason for that, as your last piece pointed out, is that sterling has depreciated, and therefore import prices in pounds in our pockets look more expensive. Now, that's a one-off effect. It's called a pass-through effect, and the Bank of England predict it'll last for around about a year or so. So it will drop out of the figures next year. And of course, it's you know, good that at the same time we are able to end the cap. It's good news.
We must leave it there, but I fear you don't look any more comfortable than when I started this.
Absolutely
not.
I'm
very comfortable. I'm extremely comfortable.
Well, I think Chris has been very eloquent in explaining that numbers do matter when it comes to the police service across England and Wales.
Steve White, Chris Philp, thank you both very much indeed.
There is no doubt about it. For most public sector workers, the last decade has been pretty miserable on the pay front. Pay freezes, pay caps, and in recent months, a spike in inflation to really rub salt into the wounds. So most would forgive public sector workers in general for not immediately jumping for joy at the news the government is finally lifting the cap. There will be rises above 1% for police and prison officers and a more flexible approach for others next year. But with inflation clocking in at 2.9% today, the battle lines between government and unions are being hastily redrawn, with the latter calling today's announcement derisory. There's talk of strikes, and they'll have Labour on their side. Jeremy Corbyn said his party would end the pay cap for all public sector workers.
The hated public sector pay cap might be dead in the water, but here in Brighton, news of pay rises of 2% and under for police and prison officers have only hardened the mood amongst unions, already spoiling for strike action.
Striking is always a last resort, not least for public servants who can't afford to lose a day's pay because they've had real pay cuts for so long, and they care about the services that they deliver. But I think the government would be making a big mistake to underestimate just how frustrated and angry people feel.
Only the government appeared to believe the announcement might spread a little sunshine.
We feel now is the time to move to a more flexible approach to make sure we do deal with any issues we've got in the public services so we can continue to have world-class services.
That was not how it was being seen in Brighton as I discussed the pay award with prison officer Andy Baxter. In 2009, his pay as a senior officer was £30,400. In 8 years, it's gone up by just £750. A rise of 1.7% now, well below inflation, is the last straw.
They are really struggling to recruit and retain, and this award won't do anything to improve that. In fact, it will probably have the opposite effect. There were maybe some staff who were hanging on to see what the pay award was. It may now make them make the decision they want to change careers.
The threat of mass strike action is very much in the air here in Brighton. A weaker government and a public mood turning against austerity has strengthened the hand of the unions. Nothing in today's announcement does anything to head off that threat. Inside, the Labour leader was giving short shrift to the pay award.
The Labour Party totally rejects the Tories' attempt to divide and rule, to play one sector off against another. A Labour government will end the public sector pay cap and give all workers the pay rise they deserve and so desperately need.
Other public sector workers will have to wait to hear how much they'll be getting. The pay freeze might have thawed, but the unions, backed by Labour, are sensing the wind is behind them and are ready for a fight. Romilly Weeks, News at 10, Brighton.
So, just when the government looks to be loosening the pay purse strings, well, a bit anyway, the cost of living is moving ever faster ahead. Today's inflation figure of 2.9% is the highest for 5 years. And once again, the post-Brexit fall in the value of the pound has pushed up the price of imports like clothes and petrol.
As a nation, we import far more than we export. It's an imbalance that's proved a vulnerability since we voted to leave the European Union. The fall in the value of the pound has made the things we ship in more expensive. The cost of living is rising, and in Manchester, the Sparer family is feeling it. One income, 2 children, and the pound in their pocket is buying less.
Price of everything's gone up. Petrol, gas, electric, food. It's all just increasing.
Inflation has been driven higher by a record rise in the price of clothing and footwear, up 4.6% in the last year. But whether it's the price of a new car, the price of filling it up, heating your home or eating out, prices across the board are higher than they were a year ago. Inflation has been on the up ever since the slump in the pound that followed the referendum last year. Pay growth has struggled to keep up. The result is an uncomfortable squeeze on living standards. It is the Bank of England's job to keep prices stable, and yet they are unstable. Inflation is above target and headed in the wrong direction. Until now, the Bank of England has been more concerned about weak economic growth and Brexit than it has above target inflation. Indeed, the bank believes that inflation will peak in the next few months and that pay rises will become progressively more generous. It is betting that this squeeze on living standards will be short-lived. Of course, the bank may be proved wrong. Samantha Yare runs a chain of 5 clothes shops. Her costs and her prices continue to rise.
Our clothes are often designed in the UK but are from abroad, manufactured abroad. They buy in dollars, they then charge us in pounds. So the weak pound means that that is where the increase has come, really.
The Bank of England meets tomorrow to decide what to do about interest rates. It's under some pressure to put them up.
I think we need an interest rate rise to get the economy back into balance. Borrowers have been doing very well with very low interest rates, but savers have been struggling. A healthy economy needs to have the right balance between savers and borrowers.
City investors don't think we'll see an interest rate rise until next summer. By then, our future trading relationship with the EU, on which so much depends, should be clearer. Joel Hills, News at 10.
And Robert Peston is with me here. Now, Robert, I've lost count of the amount of times we talked about the government's economic policy, which was to balance the public finances. Now they're doing this, but there's no new money. What's the economic policy?
Well, there may be a sort of cunning plan hidden in here somehow and somewhere, but I can't quite see it, because it seems to me the government is getting the worst of all possible worlds. On the one hand, it's saying there's a bit more money for police officers and for prison officers, but the pay rises are still significantly less than the rate of inflation, real earnings still falling. So police officers, prison officers still very grumpy. They are saying that, this is the government, that the 1% ceiling is going. There'll be more flexibility. But again, they're not saying there's going to be great generosity. But almost any across-the-board or significant rise in public sector pay will cost the government money. So they are simultaneously continuing to alienate public service workers by apparently not being very generous. Remember, we've had 7 years of pay restraint for public service workers, and almost none of them felt they could vote for the Tories in the last election. And then, at the same time, if they had a single identifiable economic policy, it was reducing the deficit, and, you know, many of their supporters think they are now blowing up their economic credibility. So it doesn't look, to me, at the moment, very clever.
I'm sure it will be transformed, but we'll see. Moving on to inflation, pretty high today. We haven't talked about interest rates for a bit. What's your own take? Going up or not?
So, until today, I genuinely didn't think interest rates were likely to rise until, you know, well into next year, because the economy was reasonably soft. But, you know, there was a significant leap in inflation today, back to 2.9%. On the old RPI measure, it's actually over 4%, which looks like proper inflation. Now, the Bank of England does not think there's very much spare capacity in the economy. At the moment, most of this inflation is being driven by rising import prices, but there are members of the Monetary Policy Committee who set interest rates who will be concerned that that will start to feed through to slightly more worrying endemic inflation. There's a decision this week on whether to raise interest rates. I think it won't happen this week, but I would be staggered if it didn't happen, this rise in interest rates, considerably earlier than next summer.
OK, we'll be back to it, no doubt, for now. Robert, thank you very much indeed.
Just 4 months ago, that ominous phrase dominated the Conservatives' election campaign. There was no magic money tree, we were told over and over again. It was the response to nurses, to teachers, to everyone whose pay had been capped for 7 long years. Don't ask for more, there isn't any. Yet today it seems there was. Baby steps for some sectors were announced, the rest we're told will follow. So is this the beginning of the end of austerity? Prison staff will see their average salary go up with today's 1.7% rise. They can expect to take home an additional £706. Police officers receive an average £41,500. Today they were told they'd get a 1% pay rise and a 1% bonus, meaning they could take home an additional £830 a year. Now, if we look at this graph from the ONS, we can see that public sector pay a decade ago largely matched private pay. That is, until just after the financial crash of 2008, when we saw a dramatic drop in private sector pay. Since then, the private sector pay has remained lower and more turbulent than the public sector, although it has been narrowing in recent months. So is this a change of heart, a change of tactic, or was it always the plan? We'll debate in a moment. First, to Nick Watt, the TUC in Brighton.
It's been a relentless political pounding they've withstood for nearly a decade. Now, buffeted on all sides since her general election setback, Theresa May finally announced a change of heart on one of the defining characteristics of this government.
The winds are howling here on Brighton Beach, and 50 miles north in London, the winds are changing too, after the Cabinet agreed to lift the public sector pay cap. It's all a far cry from that general election moment.
My wage slips from 2009 reflect exactly what I'm earning today. So how can that be fair?
We have had to take some hard choices across the public sector in relation to public sector pay restraint, but there isn't a magic money tree that we can shake.
Downing Street regards today's announcement as a significant step because the cap has been an important weapon in balancing the public finances. A series of factors came together to produce today's decision. In the first place, Cabinet ministers felt liberated to speak out after Theresa May's poor performance in the general election. The Democratic Unionists are no fan of the cap. And finally, the Prime Minister felt that under George Osborne, the government failed to show enough appreciation of servants of the public realm.
Well, it's great news that after 7 very difficult years recovering from Labour's financial crisis, we're now in a position to end the 1% public sector pay cap. That's great news for public sector workers. Of course, it's worth remembering that although the pay cap's set at 1%, in fact, the vast majority of public sector workers have been getting more than 1%. So in the NHS, for example, nurses have been averaging more like 3% as they progress through the pay scales.
No doubt the government hoped that today's announcement would lead to a less hostile start to the conference season at the TUC in Brighton. Public sector workers had other ideas.
I joined at 18, so, you know, I joined to become a firefighter. It's something I always wanted to do, and so money necessarily wasn't the issue, but now I certainly, you know, I literally live month to month, and so do a lot of my other colleagues.
Teachers and people who work in education across the public sector as well, we are feeling the pinch. We are at a situation now where myself and colleagues are looking at payday loans, and we're looking at food banks, and especially in education, we're not just feeding ourselves, and we're not just providing for our own families. We actually find ourselves providing for the children who are being impacted by this long-term austerity measure.
You know that something is deeply wrong.
The guest of honour in Brighton was unamused.
Today, as inflation rises to nigh on 3%, they try to divide people on the cheap. The POA is right. A pay cut is a pay cut. We must be united in breaking the pay cap for all workers.
So warm applause for Jeremy Corbyn there as he pledged to break the public sector pay cap for all workers. He sees today's announcement by the government as another climb down after Labour's success in the general election. But he also believes that pay rises substantially below the rate of inflation will create continuing political pain for the government.
One trade union leader, whose members are among the first to benefit, was unimpressed.
But the reality is this is a pay cut for my members. We've got inflation running at 2.9%. My members will be angry and devastated at this. And everybody knows that our members have come under a permanent injunction because of Section 127 of the 1994 Criminal Justice Public Order Act, which makes it illegal to induce prison officers to take any form of action. But we have, within our membership, 4,000 operational support grades who do not come under that restriction. And the National Executive Committee of the POA will look at that very closely, and we may well be asking our members a question as to what they want us to do next.
Today may well be remembered as a seminal moment for this government as it relaxes the pace of austerity. Ministers know only too well that changing the political weather may not pay dividends at the ballot box.
Well, Nick is back from Brighton with me now. Is the government happy, Nick, do you sense, with how this has gone down today, how it's been received?
Well, I spoke to one member of the Cabinet who, it's fair to say, has been pressing for this to happen, and this member of the Cabinet said to me, this is a moment. So they're happy, but not exactly overjoyed. And talking to other members of the Cabinet, I sense a certain frustration that maybe the announcement hasn't quite landed exactly where they wanted it to land. And there's a feeling that the perception is today that what was announced today is a template for the future. And they're saying, no, today, prison officers and police, that is about this year's financial settlement, and they're backdating it. For the future, it's going to be a different system. There's going to be a lot of work to look at the problems of recruitment and retention for teachers and nurses, and do you you need to increase pay to ensure that you can keep the number of workers that you need? And I said, well, does that mean that it's going to be more generous? And this member of the Cabinet said to me, there's going to be a lot of work done on this. It's a different system. Wait and see.
I don't know what that means. You mentioned the DUP. In your piece, a little more on the kind of role that they are assuming now.
Well, obviously the government made its own decision today, but it's pretty clear that the DUP played a pivotal role in this decision today. Now, this agreement here, this is between the Conservatives and the DUP back in June, a confidence and supply agreement. You do not see a word in there about removing the public sector cap that we had today, but the DUP made absolutely clear during their negotiations that it would have to go. This here says that the DUP will support finance bills, budgets, and I think it's pretty clear that unless we had got this announcement by November the 22nd, which is the day of the budget, they would not support it. But what do we have tomorrow? A vote in Parliament on the pay cap, and the DUP still are saying they reserve the right to vote against the government tomorrow.
Nick, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining us now, perhaps to clarify, to shed a little bit of light on some of that, Lord Maud, the former Paymaster General. Frances Maud was an architect, you'll remember, of the austerity agenda under David Cameron. Also with us from Parliament, where she's been voting in the Chamber, is Annalise Dodds, the Shadow Financial Secretary to the Treasury. Welcome to you both. Lord Maud, if I can just start with you, is this a move that you yourself would have made?
Well, I think there's no sense that a 1% pay cap is the law of the Medes and Persians, which has to be in place for all time. This is quite a limited decision today. It applies only to 2 sectors. It's very sensibly not built into the baseline for the future. It's 1% additional, not consolidated as a one-off payment. But what we sometimes leave out of account is the fact that many public sector workers have not been subject to a strict 1% pay cap anyway. They've been getting automatic increases from year to year. And of course, when you look at total reward, not just the pay, but everything comes with pensions, all the terms and conditions that public sector workers have, then on average, they are and have been for quite some time better paid than workers in the private sector.
Well, and I think Chris Phelps was making that point in the film, but just to steer us a little bit with what you're hearing today, for an architect of austerity, does this seem like the right time to now be moving ahead to say, OK, the deficit is under control, we can do this now?
Well, no, I mean, the deficit is clearly not under control.
So should they be doing this?
Well, we
then?
are at the end of quite a long period, or in quite a long period of sustained economic growth, and yet we still have a budget deficit that is too big. We should be at this stage in a place where the budget deficit has been eliminated and we're getting towards a surplus. We're not. And so the idea that there is suddenly lots of money around is complete fantasy. My concern is actually we need to be much more focused on what we're getting for the money that we spend. We showed in the coalition government from 2010 to 2015 that you could get more for less. This was regarded as impossible, and yet we cut the running costs of government by cumulatively over £50 billion in 5 years, and yet actually the quality of public services, if anything, improved in that
I know
time.
that Annalise will have a lot to say about that point in particular. I will come to you in a second, but just let me try and get a sense. If this then opens the lid, as Nick suggested, to all public sector workers,
which it clearly will,
and that's an OK thing, that's a good thing.
Well, I think it's whether it's good or bad, it's inevitable. You can't lift it for a couple of sectors, and all the signals have been... No, I'm not happy that we are giving the impression that we can suddenly spend money to alleviate a particular political pressure point.
I mean, you built a reputation, didn't it? Your party built a reputation on saying, we have got to get this right. You know, financial, economic stability and responsibility before anything else. Does that risk...
Well, pay rates are not the be-all and end-all. What matters is how much are you spending and what are you getting for it. The Treasury have always used pay rates as an important regulator of public spending. What they should be much more focused on is actually what are we getting for the money. And that drive to efficiency that I was happy to lead during the coalition government, the foot's been taken off the accelerator on that. And that's where the focus needs to be, getting back the drive to efficiency, because, you know, there may well be a case for, increasing pay in particular areas where there is a recruitment and retention pressure.
Annalise Dodds, you've been very patient there. From what you've heard, do you accept that this is something that has been achieved and you can move on because of the efficiency that the Conservatives managed?
Absolutely not. And I think the situation we have at the moment is of extreme shortage in many areas of our public services, particularly nursing, but also in teaching, many other parts of public service. And ultimately, the independent pay review bodies are able to look at factors when there are shortages and other issues and produce a recommendation. They've been in this straitjacket of 1% for the last few years. That hasn't been good for recruitment and retention. And, you know, when we talk about efficiency, really with many of these services, there's no fat left. We're cutting at the bone now. We're cutting away essential services. We've got patients who aren't being treated properly, potentially in dangerous situations because staffing levels are so low. We really need to see our public sector workers having the pay that they deserve.
Isn't the difficulty for Labour that you have well-respected bodies, for example, the IFS, accusing Labour of, I think their words were, pretending everything can be paid for by the same plans to tax the richest? It can't keep going round and round and round, that money.
Well, no, and actually Labour in this regard has been very, very clear about where we would get the funds from. I mean, even if you use the Conservative government's own figures on what they said that their pay cap would save, they said that it would save £1.25 billion a year. Of course, they've just decided that they've got £1 billion a year to give to the DUP for their deal. So actually, on their figures, we can afford this. But Labour, anyway, has set out in our programme, we set it out at the election exactly how we would pay for this. We used pretty conservative figures, actually, to set out what we thought the cost would be.
I wonder why you've done this, why the Conservatives have done this. The unions aren't happy. As you've said, a lot of public sector workers are now going to assume that the gates are open and they can ask for more. You're trying to move on to Labour's territory where, you know, you've already heard Jeremy Corbyn say today that, you know, Labour will be breaking the pay cap for all workers. You're not going to do it politically, so why would you? Isn't it a massive risk for your party?
Yes, I think it's a risk. I'm not so interested in whether it's a risk for the party. There are risks in this for the public finances. And, you know, at the end of it, you have to earn the money to pay wages. Annalise is talking about the pressure on the staffing levels in some parts of the public sector. Well, this is said to be within existing budgets. So any extra money that's spent on pay levels...
So Annalise, more money for...
Unless you find
more money
savings in the running
for fewer members of staff working in that. Is that's no equation you'd accept, is it?
No, it's not. And actually, I'm extremely concerned about the claims coming from government that this will be paid for from within existing budgets. I mean, people will be watching this and will be aware that in their areas, policing, for example, is already incredibly stretched.
We'll take the police, take the prison services. If they choose to strike now, we know that's technically illegal. Would you support them?
Well, I don't think anybody wants to have a strike. I think the whole point is that people have been pushed very far, that they're starting to talk about this. Labour has said we shouldn't have industrial action. We shouldn't be pushed into this situation because government should be actually listening to those public sector workers.
For those strikes. You presumably, as the party that would break the cap on workers, if they're not getting those rises, you would support them.
I think industrial action, where it's been voted upon properly, where the workers decide that that is the right thing and where they've democratically been consulted about it, that is their right ultimately. But I don't want us to have that strike. I want us to get to a situation where public sector workers are paid properly, and the government needs to listen to them and listen to the public because they're actually calling out for this change too.
Thank you both very much indeed. Thanks for coming in.
Anyway, Melanie Phillips and Ian Dunt are here. Pay all over the papers. The Metro keeps it simple. Pay thaw. May lifts 1% public sector cap, while other papers like The Eye warn of the reaction from unions should the government not do more to address this issue.
I mean, the interesting thing politically is looking at the union reaction is not any kind of gratefulness at all, but actually that sort of recognition of, oh, OK, we've got momentum here, we've got you here, and we're going to push much, much harder.
On the ropes kind of feeling.
Yeah, exactly. So strategically, in terms of dealing with the unions, it doesn't seem to have done any good at all, and in fact, arguably has made things worse. Then you look at the rest of the coverage. I think it was the Times somewhere that was focusing on, actually the cuts you'd have to services if you're going to provide this. So even the press reaction has actually not been that positive.
Yeah, the Telegraph, Bobby's on the beat will be cut to fund the 2% pay rise.
Yeah, because as we were saying earlier, this is coming out of the existing budget. The budget is not being expanded. So if you give more money over here, you've got to take it away from over here. Classic sleight of hand. So if you're sat in Downing Street right now and think, well, look, we're trying to stave off this sort of new winter of discontent. We're trying to make it look as if we're kinder, we're not so bad. We're trying to stop Jeremy Corbyn from being able to advance onto our lawns in this way. You would look at this and say, this is not ideal. This is not the response that we wanted.
I agree entirely. It just seems so incoherent and ill thought through. It seems to me to be a sort of knee-jerk response to the sort of panic that took over after the near miss with Jeremy Corbyn and the election, in which the Conservatives suddenly said, oh my goodness, the public actually don't like austerity. We must head off Jeremy Corbyn by throwing some money at them. Well, as Ian has said, I mean, it's a sleight of hand because there's no fresh money. It's divisive because it's setting one group against the other, so it's likely to enrage trade unions more than others. But even more than that, I mean, austerity, people don't like austerity for obvious reasons, but what they don't like even more is lack of integrity and lack of consistency. And if you're going to say to people, as the government did say, we're in a parlous position, we're spending too much, we're borrowing too much, we've got to pull spending back, and it's going to be painful for everybody. Everybody might sort of, leap up and down and say this is terrible, but basically that's the strategy, that's the policy.
So a kind of political honesty is what you're saying.
Yes, and if the next moment you're saying, well, in fact, that's it, now austerity's over, chaps. I mean, everyone's saying, well, what was all that for then? I mean, are we now out of the woods? Is the country no longer in a state of, are the country's finances now absolutely fine? It's clearly absurd from every single point of view. And there seems to be no strategic thinking going on anywhere. At no level in government. No one's got any sense. No one's got any common sense.
Is that because Theresa May lost her key advisors, do you think? Or simply
they're even worse.
Or that they are distracted by everything that Brexit brings with it?
Well, I don't know. I would imagine that Mrs May is thinking about nothing but Brexit, but that's really no excuse. I mean, she is the Prime Minister of a country which has to keep running, and it's no excuse for this sort of incoherence.
So what's the alternative then to using the money from existing budgets, only picking a couple of public sector workers or sectors which will get the increase? What could they have done instead?
Well, I mean, you have to end austerity, which is basically to say that we're going to borrow more money or we're going to tax people more. I mean, it really is as simple as that. But of course, to do that would trigger a rebellion on the Tory benches, so it can't be done. So instead, you get this sort of presentational sort of front, but no real content to go behind it. And again, it just points to a sort of government that doesn't really have any values, doesn't really have any principles, no convictions. It's just staggering from one story to another, terrified of this, of Jeremy Corbyn, who is himself this really quite shambolic politician. Extraordinary to see him now basically calling the shots across the political spectrum. Look, at the heart of this is also the fact that there really is no authority in Downing Street. There's a Prime Minister, but it's a Prime Minister really in name only. She has no authority to go along with the job title. She can't enforce her will. So at various times, you get various different ministers who are able to push their agenda forward, and it just, what you get is basically no character to government whatsoever, no real sense of drive or purpose to it. And you're presented with the kind of thing that we see right now, which is, you're almost unable to attribute to any characteristics whatsoever.
Yeah, I like this Quentin Lett's review of Jeremy Corbyn at the TUC conference. Mr Corbyn's speech, half-hearted at best, opened with some stuff about a Colombian trade union activist, etc., etc. He's trying to criticise it when actually he was in his element today, and the audience were absolutely loving what he was saying.
Yeah, there's a Patrick Kidd sketch in the Times where he's sort of talking about these old Labour leaders when they used to go to the TUC. You'd have Tony Blair there. If you remember, you would just want to crawl into the floor when Tony Blair was talking to them. He would sort of start saying, and just total silence and hatred coming from the TUC. Now, of course, Jeremy Corbyn comes and he is, the king over the water, brought in, absolutely loved by the people there, and he gets this rather raucous reception.
Yeah. Did you want to say something about
I was just going to say it's a rather sort of dismal accolade that the Trade Union Congress fawns over Jeremy Corbyn. It's not something that fills me with a great deal of enthusiasm that they are so keen on Jeremy Corbyn. But it takes something to, to make Jeremy Corbyn look like a statesman in waiting.
Well, the unions do represent workers, obviously, and the workers feel that they're on the march at the moment, don't they? That's kind of the point, I suppose. But
there is some tension in the relationship actually over Brexit, which we'll come to later. But actually, you started to see that last few weeks, the TUC being a bit more strident in their opposition towards leaving the single market. Unite has been a union that's been quite torn on that sort of thing. On the manufacturing wing, there's been concern about leaving the single market, but the sort of more pro-Corbyn wing has been much more positive about Brexit. And actually, the one source of tension in that relationship really does stem on Corbyn's sort of quite mercurial view of the subject. That's the only real bit of tension, but they're still, considering him in extremely warm terms.
yes, and there's the political sketch you talked about in the Times, but you also wanted to talk about Sadiq Khan, also on this inside pages of the Times.
Yes, I mean, Sadiq Khan apparently, according to the story in the Times, wants to make a speech at the Labour Party conference, but there are plans to exclude him from the podium. Now, it's not entirely clear quite why Mr. Khan is being denied this opportunity, but it would appear that a number of other people are also being denied the podium. Several front benchers responsible for key portfolios such as defence, transport and housing. Mr. Corbyn and his allies insist that the event should be devoted to policy debates for the rank and file membership. It does sound rather as if the entire Labour Party conference is going to be devoted to tractor production in the Ukraine.
We do have, it has to be said that the people that are speaking, especially mentioned in this article, John McDonnell, Emily Thornberry, Diane Abbott, of course, key sort of Corbyn loyalists. There is Keir Starmer there, who isn't quite be considered a Corbyn loyalist, but has managed to sort of, keep his nose clean on this sort of stuff and hasn't really been attacking Corbyn in any meaningful way. He's been trying to work inside of the tent, really, on the stuff that he does. So you get this impression of it being structured around the power of the leader. This is, of course, the first conference since he's had an unexpectedly successful sort of general election campaign. Impossible to know what really went on there, but certainly very, very interesting to see the names that are being
It looks like organisation and strategy, which everyone criticised Jeremy Corbyn for lacking at the beginning.
Yes, but I mean, you see, we've been sort of hammering on against Mrs May and the sort of chaos in the Conservative government. But what all this reminds us is the appalling plight, as it were, of the so-called moderates in the Labour Party, who are just sitting there watching their party be destroyed and being taken over by this hard-left faction and not doing anything about it. And this, to me, is actually as worrying, if not more worrying, than the difficulties that Mrs May is experiencing.